In recent news, a 29-year-old woman decided to end her life with the physician's assistance due to a terminal diagnosis of brain cancer. Today, our society would have us believe that physician-assisted suicide is death with dignity, that we reserve the right to die on our own terms at our own time, but only when diagnosed with a terminal illness. Our society, in all of its inconsistency, will say that the value of life is objective. That is, that life is inherently valuable in cases of murder, assault, rape, and even unprecedented suicide. But once diagnosed with a terminal illness, once a doctor tells us that our time is limited, the value of life becomes subjective. The value of life is less inherent and more about how the individual feels, and however one feels is okay. So suicide is acceptable and even dignified in these circumstances. I disagree. I say that society is wrong. I say that life is always valuable, and unfortunately, death is never dignified. Our time is limited the moment we are born, and no physician can ever give us a time limit on how much we have left. I say that the right to die is a slippery slope that is all too easy to slide down, as is demonstrated in the Netherlands euthanasia program. I say that the right to die is a violation of the autonomy that we fight so hard for. And I say that any physician who assists in an attempted or completed suicide by a patient is guilty of a crime and violates the Hippocratic oath that he swore when granted his medical license. Physicians have a moral responsibility as a patient's healer, and the American Medical Association says that the role as healer is incompatible with the idea of physician-assisted suicide. The American Medical Association recognizes a difference between the intent of allowing a patient to refuse life-saving medical treatment and making that patient die by administering lethal medicine. The American Medical Association says that this takes the responsibility of the patient's death and places it onto the physician, therefore making it an immoral act to do. The Hippocratic Oath, in its originality, swore, I will neither give a patient a medication that causes his death or make a suggestion to that effect. I say that life is objective, it is not subjective. Suicide is illegal, murder is illegal. If we take that objectivity and turn it into subjectivity in the cases of terminal illness, we then take the objectivity away, making it illogical to prosecute anyone for any crime involving another person. If life is subjective, then does life matter at all? Who decides if an illness is terminal enough? No doctor can ever give us a time limit on how much we have left. For example, Erica Reel of Vermont testified against physician-assisted suicide in 2013, saying that she was diagnosed terminally ill by 3 different physicians. Her family urged her to seek another opinion, and because of that opinion, she's still alive today, as they diagnosed her differently than the original 3 diagnoses. Claire Shope of Vermont is a mother and a grandmother who is about to be 66 years old, and she is a cancer survivor. Claire was told that she had stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and that it was terminal, incurable, and that it was throughout her bone marrow, and she had less than a year to live. That was 26 years ago today. Jack Caulfield of Westminster, Vermont, in 2002 was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It had appeared to spread to all of his internal organs, and the diagnosis was grim. A year later, Jack was told to get his affairs in order, that he would be dying soon. Jack lived 3.5 years beyond his diagnosis, longer than the doctors had originally believed. 3 out of 4 cases of attempted suicide, are due to depression, and once the depression has been treated, patients no longer want to commit suicide. Suicide is an emotion-based decision, and it is never based on logic. So how then do we determine the competency of anyone attempting to choose suicide? The state says that competency cannot always be assessed with certainty. This means that patients who, in the midst of depression, would have chosen suicide and later treated no longer want suicide would not have been given the chance to finish out their life when no longer depressed. And in a study of the Netherlands conducted in 1990, despite strict guidelines, euthanasia became a slippery slope. There were 2,300 cases of voluntary euthanasia at request of the patient. There were 400 cases of assisted euthanasia in which the doctors physically administered the medication. There were more than 1,000 cases of euthanasia without explicit consent. and there were 4,941 of lethal morphine injections without explicit consent. Even in a medical situation with regulations in place, euthanasia becomes a slippery slope for those who cannot advocate for themselves and those who will not advocate for themselves. And the reality is that we do possess the right to die if we so choose. But what we don't possess is the right to request that a physician assist in our suicide. Asking the right for assisted suicide forces a physician to engage in actions that go against the very foundation of his profession. These actions are unable to be adequately regulated, and it takes the objective value of life, placing it into the hands of fallible, emotion-driven men and women.